Hello, everyone. I'm going to be kind of steering the ship on this webinar here. Welcome. Because I wanted to share with everyone some work we've been doing on the dashboard, specifically dashboards displaying the COVES aggregate data. So just for some context, I know a lot of folks here are like newer to COVES or within the past like year or two. And some of you may not even have seen your dashboards yet because you haven't collected enough data yet or just kind of starting out. So bear with me. I'll try to be as clear as possible about what you're seeing in case you're not familiar with it. But it's relatively easy to understand. So of course, when we talk about COVES to everyone, we talk about one of the advantages being that you can compare yourself to the COVES aggregate data. And it's been a little bit messy during COVID. Oh, sorry, Joey. Yeah, we'll be able to, I'll work out the individual username and password things. Just send me an email afterward. I guess that's a blanket thing. If you feel like something is wrong with your dashboard or you're missing something or there's an update that hasn't been made yet, like to the logins, just shoot me an email either right now or right afterward, and I'll kind of clean everything up. But anyway, comparing yourselves to the aggregate. During COVID, it got a little bit messy and there was the method changes, email, staff. But before COVID, the sites that were participating in COVES, we kind of had this one dashboard that was COVES aggregate data. And it was really similar to the dashboard that people saw for their own museum, but just only the aggregate displayed, none of the institution specific questions that people sometimes have. And then there was a page where you could look side by side and comparing yourself to the aggregate. So it's really like a little bit cleaner, a little bit easier way than clicking a bunch of times or switching back and forth between different dashboards or waiting for the aggregate report to come out every year. So I'm happy to say that I've managed to kind of get that infrastructure going again for both art museums and science museums. Right now they're on separate aggregate dashboards, although we could change our minds in the future if you all suggest that. But I wanted to just share my screen and talk through some of the features of this dashboard. And once this is over, I will give everyone access. If you already have a login, if you don't, that'll come soon. And happy to take any questions after I go through it. I don't know if it'll take, a super long time, but I could always be surprised. So the first thing I'm going to do is share my screen to share with you. I'm going to use the COVES art aggregate dashboard as an example because it's a newer thing I worked on. So you'll see right away, for those of you who haven't seen the dashboard before, the first thing you see up at the top is your net promoter score, your overall experience ratings, kind of the big ticket, like #1 things that people want to see. But a couple other things to notice is you should see COVES art aggregate data up here as the title. There's these 2 pages. There's at the top here, there's a few filters that are preset that you can use. You can filter by any available date. You can filter by method. I've set it by default to the staffed and the QR code because those are kind of our in-person classic COVES methods, but we know there is some email data still included in both the art and the science data set. We have institution size, and then AAM region. I'll talk about that one a little bit, that you can sort of look and categorize the data by. So the aggregate dashboard really just displays a basic readout of all the data that you're collecting and maybe used to seeing on your dashboard: net promoter score, overall experience rating. This chart, which sort of shows each of those individual experience ratings and how well or not well they correlate with the net promoter score. So how often they sort of the scores are related to each other or go together. Sometimes people give a high rating to net promoter score and also a high rating to educational experience, for example. So that chart will kind of show this, and that's in the aggregate sense. And then, of course, all the individual ratings. And art museums have a couple ones that science museums don't have, such as the wayfinding question, feeling welcomed. You'll see these scores are super high, and the net promoter score for art museums also super high that we're seeing in this data. So that's really cool to see. And motivations in your own dashboard, when you see this, it'll say visitation and you'll see like visited such and such gallery, or which exhibit, program, or show did you go to. Obviously those aren't included in the aggregate data because that's kind of a mess with all of those things. And also you don't really necessarily care to know how many people went to another museum's like store or something like that. Although in the future, there could be temporary exhibits that cross over, and that would be an interesting thing to see. But for now, you just have the motivations categories that overlap, including the art survey's newer motivations question, which is really exciting to see some of that data. It overlaps in some ways with the science surveys question, but has some additional categories that we feel were, kind of looked to the research and developed with the art instrument team. So take a look at that. It's really cool. And then, of course, most of the rest of the dashboard, especially for those of you who aren't familiar with it yet, is demographics. So it starts with the group demographics and then with individual demographics, because of course the COVES survey, sort of the unit of analysis, the survey pertains to one group, but there are of course questions that go to the individual who's responding to the survey. So just kind of going through these, the only thing maybe to note, we have group types, number of children among groups who brought children to art museums. Some of these things will look a little different between science and art just because of the feedback we've gotten from art museums about what ways are most useful to visualize the data. There's only one spot right here where there's not, the data isn't kind of updated yet, sort of looking at the gender of all the adults and children in the groups. So like the full group member data that's coming, it's just sort of filling in from the back. So it'll display once I'm done recoding it. And then of course we have our, residence questions or disability questions, which are also asked of the full group. And then those more individual demographic questions. Membership, an important thing to note about membership is that if you have a membership question that is different from just the yes, no, it won't be included in here. So that's just something to keep in mind. There may be a way to kind of make that work, but so far it's just those who are using that kind of yes, no membership format. Yeah, and of course, like, last visit, number of visits in the past year, just kind of going through everything on the survey, just displayed very simply. And then at the very bottom, there's a little bit of metadata about the survey, like the full number, or about the dashboard, I'm sorry, full number of data points included, the duration, how long it's taking people to fill out the survey in the aggregate lens, looking at, month by month, year by year, how many responses are we seeing in the dashboard. So that's just to kind of help you contextualize like what you're seeing in the data, to give you some background on how many, of course, there's several years already with art museums included now. So can be interesting to look at, smaller, more recent time periods, or look across, this full spectrum, really whatever you want to do. And just another note, especially, for those of you who haven't used the dashboard a lot yet, I mentioned filters. So in addition to these filters at the top, you can also click on almost any chart on the page and create your own filter. So if I were interested in looking at everyone who rated art museums as outstanding in this aggregate data set, I could just click on that and just like wait a couple seconds for the dashboard to think through it. And then it'll sort of narrow down to show you just those individuals. So it's a really interesting tool for looking across, narrowing down different groups. The cool thing with the aggregate data is for kind of narrowing down into different sort of subcategories is there's so much data that you don't, it's harder to get into that place where you're looking at like one person or 10 people. And so you can kind of go a little bit deeper in that. So it's a lot of fun. So that's relatively basic. I don't know if anyone has like, if you're confused or have questions as I'm going, feel free to just put them in the chat or raise your hand or something. The next part I want to show you all and explain a little bit, I'm going to use the Science Museum dashboard, which you'll see looks very similar, as an example. And I'm actually going to use the Museum of Science data as an example. So are you seeing something that says with the big red text on the top now? Yeah, okay, great. So this is the side-by-side comparison to aggregate, the sort of system we had set up to make it as easy as possible to sort of visually compare yourself, your museum's data to the aggregate data. So this is the science dashboard. You see the aggregate. We've collected over 50,000 responses since July 2016. So there's a lot of data here in the science survey. And then the Museum of Science here just filtered down to be showing this. So every single chart that I showed you on the page before sort of has a duplicate, and that will show your net promoter score, your overall experience rating, your demographics, your motivations, whatever, compared to on the other side, the aggregate. And they're all labeled either aggregate or yours. And the thing to note about the aggregate is it's not in this visualization, it's not sort of everyone, it's everyone minus you. So we sort of went with that back in when we were setting this up for the science sites, specifically asked by an institution who collected like a lot of data. So the Exploratorium kind of brought this up with us, Josh Gutwell. Exploratorium was one of the largest sites in the collaboration, collected so many data points that they felt that, in some ways they were kind of pulling the aggregate so much that they were more interested in looking at, what does it look like without our data kind of pulling everything every which way. So thought that was a pretty compelling point. And, it's sort of like a little bit of an attempt at weighting the data, or kind of, not exactly, but sort of trying to make sure that your data isn't skewing or pulling or anything too far. It's not an issue for everyone, but for those who it is, it can be really helpful. Yes, and Beth, this science, I should say, this is Science Plus. This is like all the ASTC members, so science, natural history, those children's museums that are, ASTC members. So that's everyone who's included here. And art is like just the art museums that have joined since the COVES Art grant, and includes the Art Bridges partners. So that aggregate data, when you're looking at that, that includes all of those sites as well, who are mostly very small art museums. So that's really cool to include their data. And yeah, so you'll just see this kind of side-by-side comparison. The way that these filters work, which is kind of fun on this page, is a lot of times people say, well, okay, great, I'm a small science museum. I would really prefer just to compare myself to other small science museums, or in the Museum of Science's case, a large museum, we would maybe prefer to just compare ourselves to other large museums, at least for certain things. So with that, you can select this institution size filter. And if you select large, then the aggregate here will filter down and only show you other large museums, again, minus you. So your data will still display because you're included in, or we're included in large here. And you can see what it looks like for only larger museums. And of course, you can look at things for the museum types that you're not included in, just your score will disappear. But you'll see if we look at small and very small, which we've combined in both dashboards because they're, in the science case, there's only one or two very small, and in the art case, actually, there was only one or two small. So we didn't want to like single anyone out when separating the categories, although we could separate them in the future. Small, medium, and large institutions are defined by the COVES categories, which sometimes for science, we kind of made an an attendance bucket. But then with art museums, it's a little bit different, but it's kind of a combination of your annual attendance and budget and sort of separated in there. I could actually, I don't know off the top of my head where we draw all of the lines, but at the very bottom, there's a list of institutions that are included in each category. So yeah, so you can explore like sites that are not like you or are like you. And another one that some of our art museum friends recommended recently was this AAM region category, which I was sort of familiar with the AAM regions, but there's these 6 different ones. So I'm just in the chat. Yeah, Ryan's just saying it depends on annual budget and attendance and annual attendance kind of combined. Yeah, so AAM regions, just to give everyone some context for what they are, I'm going to shoot over this picture here. If you can see this map now. Ooh. All right, you can see the map, yeah? So these are the AAM regions that you might be looking at. There's New England, there's Mid-Atlantic in this light gray. This teal is the Southeast, Midwest is the light blue, the dark blue is mountain plains, and then the light green is west. So for a long time in COVES, we've been talking about wanting to make regional comparisons and kind of conceptualizing that by state. It was kind of hard, except for maybe like California, maybe Texas, to have that kind of comparison where it wasn't just one museum in the state or even 2 museums in the state, because then you're just kind of comparing one to one, and it's more interesting to look at a larger group if you're thinking about the region. But these AAM regions actually broke down a little bit more such that we had enough museums included in each one that it was a little more meaningful as an aggregate category. So if you don't know exactly off the top of your head where you fall, just keep this map in mind, or you can look them up on the AAM site. They're pretty easy to find. But so you can look at if I guess this is for the Museum of Science, for instance, New England. So filter down and look at only other museums that are in New England. And sometimes it just takes a second to think here, and then again, you can look at museums that aren't in your region as well. Just remember that the score will disappear from there, but just not to be alarmed. And another brief note for those of us who are multiple sited, like Beth at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. You also have the La Brea tar pits included, or like Crystal Bridges and the Momentary on the art side. By default, it should include, like the U will include all of your sites. But if you're interested in looking at maybe just one, you can look at this institution filter right here. And for the Museum of Science, it just says Museum of Science. But if it were Beth, it would say Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County and La Brea tar pits. So you can choose which comparison you want to make. Not relevant to everyone, but helpful to know. Yeah, and Marjorie says, can you filter by date? Yeah, you should, but it looks like that filter mistakenly disappeared. So I'll add it back in. It only takes a second. Thank you, Marjorie, for noticing that. Date is, of course, a really important thing to filter by, especially when you want to be comparing apples to oranges, especially when you've got like so much data. Or sorry, you want to be comparing apples to apples. Wow, you can compare whatever you want. I guess you can compare apples to oranges. Comparing yourself to the aggregate is helpful to use similar dates. Alyssa asked, we fall into one region but have visitors that are definitely from another region. Yes, you can combine two. You can select more than one. Like if I say, great, I'm New England, but Mid-Atlantic also is really similar to us, or maybe include some of our visitors. So you can just select more than one. Super easy. And then it'll filter based on that as well. So yeah, totally. And yeah, Claire is asking, are we able to access this aggregate data? It's available at the same place as our individual dashboards. That's a great question. After this call, I will give everybody access to another dashboard. So those of you who have your own, some of you, there might be like kind of dashboard ballooning problems, but this is the one that I hope we can use for our aggregate data moving forward, because it has this nice comparison tool that folks really want. So for instance, when you look at your dashboard, you click on this like drop down menu right here, and the Museum of Science, we have the Museum of Science, we have our old dashboard that kind of is out of use. We had that COVID-19 temporary dashboard, and this one is a different thing. That's for a different survey we have. So you can just navigate to the one that says COVES Art Aggregate Data, and you'll have access to both COVES Art and COVES Science. Even if you're not a science museum or not an art museum, it can be interesting to look at the other museum types data. So I'll give you all access to both of those, and you can just select it from the drop down. If you don't have a dashboard login yet, just shoot me an email. Some of you probably need to have a dashboard soon. Some of you it'll come in the next few weeks or months as you collect more data. So I think the last thing I want to point out is down at the very bottom of this comparison to aggregate page. A little bit annoying, but the best solution I've been able to come with so far is, you want to know who's included in large, medium, and small. The AM regions, like it's a little bit easier to tell because you know what state the museum is in. But this is our, sort of grouping for who's included in those different categories for science centers and natural history museums, children's museums. There's not really a good way to make this something that I don't have to kind of manually update, but I can do my best to make sure everything is included there. But when you're doing any of that filtering and you're like, wait, who's included? Because of course, also for science museums, the aggregate could include sites that participated for a couple of months back in 2017 and maybe aren't participating anymore. And so, you may have forgotten that they were part of the aggregate data, but there's still COVES data still collected there. And if you want to look at those past comparisons, that's part of the aggregate. So, those data are included as well. So just a good reminder, and it's the same on the art. The art page has the same thing, but for art. So I think that's most of the big things I wanted to hit to share this with you guys. I just really wanted to make sure that everyone kind of understood this comparison, that this aggregate minus me compared to me was clear, and that you know, and especially that you could understand and see these filters up here at the top, which I'm excited we're able to do more and more of those now. And actually, there's another one on the science page that I should add back in, which was children's focused museums. So those where adult only audiences are like less than 10% of their visitorship. That was another filter that we had used. So easy to add that back in, and the date. Thank you, Marjorie. So I will just, I mean, I'll pause there. I would love to hear, um, yes, Elisa, years they participated. We can totally do that. Um, so, oh, the other thing I guess I was going to say is there's a lot of things you could use this for. There's basically whatever your heart desires. But like as an example of one thing that a science site found very helpful in the past was they were looking at their data side by side with the aggregate and actually noticed this was this Discovery Center Museum, if Mike's on the call, that their restroom cleanliness score was lower, considerably lower than the aggregate score, which they used that information to actually seek out some I think grant money from a local or state kind of organization to do a redo of their restrooms, make them nicer, cleaner to get that score up, because they were like, hey, we're kind of actually lagging behind our peers in this sense. So that's kind of you can look for anything where maybe you feel like it's lower or higher, or can be a great like bragging point for board or for CEOs or something, to say, look at us, we're doing great, or here's where we have room to grow in comparison to the rest of the COVES cohort. And I just hope a useful tool for you all that is kind of the idea of COVES. The whole promise is that you can compare your data to the aggregate, and I hope that this tool makes it as easy as possible, or relatively easy for you to do that. So I will just pause and see if anyone has any questions or wants to add anything, or examples of how they've used aggregate data in the past. And I'll just open it up. Did I get all the questions in the chat? I think so. If no one has any burning questions right now, or anything else to share, we can just do a short webinar this week, and this can be just a display of this aggregate data, and then I can use the next half hour to get you all access to this data, so that when you log in, you have the option of seeing COVES Science and COVES Art Aggregate, and actually give you some time to explore. So I'll please throw in the chat anything if I don't want to steamroll anyone who does have a question and wants me to go through anything, even if you think you're the only one who has that question. Oh yeah, Prita just throws a Slack workspace. We've had COVES Slacks for individual teams. I think it's a really fun idea that we can explore. Oh, and I'll just kind of share out on the chat here. So Children's Discovery Museum was able to use the demographic information to show that we served underserved populations in San Jose and garner a bonus in ARP funding from the city. That's awesome. I love when data connects to funds. Yes, oh, and Shani, I shared maybe before you logged on the link to the COVES YouTube channel. So I think this is the correct link here. COVES YouTube, there's actually on that page, there's some videos of me made a while ago, so the dashboard looks a little different, but like talking about dashboard functions like filtering and stuff like that, and going through the dashboard. So that's one thing that's on the YouTube channel. And also not all, I think we didn't record every single webinar, but a lot of our webinars are recorded and kind of put up there for you to rewatch. So that YouTube channel will be the best place to find a recording of this webinar when we're done. that says, are we able to toggle by institution size, aggregate, region in our own custom pages? Do you mean on your own, like, Natural History Museum of LA dashboard? If so, I don't have that built in, but if that was of interest to people, it's really pretty easy to do. I don't know if it, oh, when you create a private page, sorry. Yeah. I think if you create a private page, it won't have those things, but this is like maybe an advanced thing that not everyone has seen. But if you know, when you're on your dashboard, you can create private pages and make your own charts. It won't break anything. It's not visible to anyone else. If you want to kind of play around in a sandbox, you're welcome to. Some sites have found really interesting things and taught me things about the dashboard that way. Completely optional. You don't have to do it, but yes, you can do that. So you can edit the page and then add your own filters, Beth, and it should be easy to find in the list, even though there's a bazillion variables. They're named like AAM region, institution size, so they should be relatively easy. And you can kind of customize that. Kate asks, will the Art Bridges sites see all art data or just Art Bridges? Art sees all art data. I don't distinguish between art and Art Bridges in that dashboard. So everyone's included, and which I think is awesome and makes the art cohort even, bigger than I dreamed it could be at this point in the art collaboration. So really, really fun to see. I'm just going to delete this page. I don't need this page anymore. All right. And I just shared the YouTube link. I kind of started typing it and then forgot. But Shinyi, if you saw the YouTube link in there, that's going to be the best place to find. Jesse Small from the Mayborn says, I'm about to present some of our museum study students how we use COVES. Anyone from this community have anything they think is valuable to share to the upcoming community of museum leaders? Open floor for that. If anyone wants to throw a name in the chat or unmute. Yeah, Ryan has answered Jesse. There's a lot of amazing use cases presented on COP Calls YouTube channel. May be great to look. Some years ago, we created a few like COVES use cases that we wrote up and kind of shared. It might be time to update those or maybe do some new ones. But I can send those your way, Jesse. Even though they're from a couple years ago, they're still examples of how institutions have used their data. So might be helpful for you. Awesome. All right. Well, with that, if anyone has any questions afterward, please feel free to email me. Just if you don't have my email, I'll put it in the chat. Can help you with all things dashboard and hopefully solve any issues that you're seeing. Yeah, and Julie just reminds everyone there's no better tool to talk about representation of your audience and comparing this data to your local demographics. Yes, absolutely. Keep that in mind. All right, so I'll let everyone, have a few minutes back, and I'll use this time to get everyone access to this data. And again, if you feel like you don't have access to the dashboard and you should, please send me an email and I will make sure to get you that access. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a lovely afternoon. And we'll see you next month. I think next month, well, it's not set in stone yet, but we're hoping to have some guest speakers next month. So stay tuned for that invitation. All right, Ryan, you can stop the recording.
Okay.